The last night under the baobab. In a small village at the edge of the Serengeti, where the baobab trees stood like ancient sentinels, there lived a woman named Nyasha. Her beauty was legendary, her skin as smooth as the river's surface at dawn, and her spirit as fierce as the lions that roared in the distance. But her heart had grown heavy, weighed down by the unraveling of her marriage to Kofi, her husband of 12 years. Kofi had once been her everything. They had met during a village dance under the moonlight, and their love had blossomed like wildflowers in the savannah. Together, they had built a life, shared laughter, and brought 2 children into the world. But as time passed, cracks appeared in the foundation of their love. Kofi's silences grew longer, his absences more frequent, and the warmth in his eyes faded like the evening sun. Nyasha tried to hold on. She prayed under the baobab tree, where her ancestors had sought guidance. She sang songs of longing and whispered her fears to the wind. But the chasm between them only widened. Then, one day, Kofi came to her with papers in hand, a petition for divorce. His voice was steady but distant, as if he had already made peace with the decision. Nyasha felt her world crumble, but she was proud and strong. If this was what he wanted, she would not beg. Still, one desire burned within her, a longing for one last night with him. Not just to rekindle the passion they once had, but to remind herself, and perhaps him, of what they had shared. She believed that if their union was truly over, it deserved a proper farewell. The night before they were to sign the papers, Nyasha prepared herself. She bathed in the river, letting the cool water wash away her doubts and fears. She adorned herself in a flowing red chitonge, the color of passion, and braided her hair with beads that jingled softly like whispered secrets. The air was thick with the scent of hibiscus and woodsmoke as she lit a fire in the yard and prepared Kofi's favorite meal, grilled tilapia with spicy jollof rice. When Kofi arrived, he was surprised by the sight. The house was aglow with lanterns, and Nyasha looked radiant, almost as if the years of bitterness had melted away. For a moment, he hesitated at the threshold, but her smile beckoned him inside. "Why all this, Nyasha?" he asked, his voice cautious. She met his gaze and said simply, "A goodbye should be beautiful, don't you think?" They ate in silence, the kind that held unspoken words and shared memories. When the meal was done, Nyasha led him outside to the baobab tree, where the moon cast its silver light. She placed a mat on the ground and gestured for him to sit. He complied, though his body was tense with uncertainty. "I have one request, Kofi," she began, her voice steady but soft. "Before we end this chapter, let me feel like your wife one last time." Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Kofi looked at her, his eyes searching hers. For a moment, he seemed about to refuse, but then he nodded. Something in her gaze stirred a forgotten tenderness in him. Under the vast African sky, they came together as they had in the early days of their love. Their bodies spoke the words their mouths could not. Nyasha felt every touch, every kiss, as if it were the last drop of water in a desert. She held on to him, memorizing the curve of his back, the rhythm of his breath, the weight of his presence. Kofi, too, was overcome by a wave of nostalgia and longing, though he did not say it aloud. When it was over, they lay side by side, listening to the night sounds, the chirping of crickets, the distant howl of a hyena. Nyasha traced patterns on his chest, her heart aching with both love and resignation. "Do you remember the first time we came here?" she whispered. Kofi nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "You made me climb this tree to fetch a bird's nest for you. And you fell," she said, laughing softly. "I thought I'd married a fool." "But you kissed me anyway," he replied, his voice tinged with affection. For a brief moment, it felt as if nothing had changed between them. But as dawn approached, reality crept in. Kofi rose, his movements slow and deliberate, and Nyasha knew the spell was broken. The next day, they signed the divorce papers in the village office. Nyasha held her head high, her face serene, though her heart was heavy. Kofi glanced at her once, as if wanting to say something, but he remained silent. As Nyasha walked away, she felt both a sense of loss and a strange peace. She had given their love a proper farewell, honoring it in a way that felt true to her spirit. And though her heart ached, she knew she would find her strength again. The baobab tree stood tall in the distance, a reminder of resilience in the enduring cycles of life. From that day on, Nyasha began a new chapter. Carrying with her the memory of their last night under the African sky, a night that would forever be etched in her heart as a bittersweet farewell to a love that once was. Months passed after the divorce, and life moved on in the village. Nyasha threw herself into raising her children and running her small business selling handmade baskets at the market. Her resilience became the talk of the community, a beacon for women facing their own struggles. But beneath her composed exterior, she often found herself drawn to the baobab tree, where the memories of her last night with Kofi lingered like the scent of rain after a storm. Kofi, too, had returned to his life. He moved to a nearby town, took a new job, and tried to rebuild. Yet, no matter how far he traveled or how busy he kept himself, something tugged at the edges of his mind, a feeling he couldn't quite name. It was Nyasha's laughter, her warmth, the way she had looked at him that final night. The silence of their separation was louder than any argument they had ever had. One day, as the rains returned and the land turned lush and green, Nyasha received an unexpected visitor. It was Mama Akiang, the village elder and keeper of its stories. The old woman had always been a source of wisdom, and her presence now felt significant. "You've been quiet, child," Mama Akiang said, settling into Nyasha's home. But the baobab does not forget. It whispers to those who are meant to listen. Nyasha raised her brows. "What are you saying, Mama?" The elder leaned closer, her eyes sharp despite her age. "You and Kofi share more than a marriage that ended. You share roots, like the baobab. Sometimes, roots are tangled and hard to separate, but they do not break so easily." Nyasha wanted to dismiss the words, to say that the past was the past. But something in Mama Akiang's tone stayed with her. Kofi returned to the village a few weeks later. He had come for a funeral, but his heart was heavy with another purpose. He passed by Nyasha's stall in the market, his steps faltering as he saw her. She looked radiant, her hair wrapped in a vibrant scarf, her hands skillfully weaving a basket. For a moment, he simply watched her, his heart aching with emotions he thought he had buried. When Nyasha noticed him, their eyes met. The air between them crackled with an unspoken tension. She nodded politely, her face unreadable, and Kofi felt a pang of regret for everything he had let slip away. That evening, he made his way to the baobab tree. He sat beneath its sprawling branches, the memories of their last night together flooding back. He stayed there until the stars appeared, hoping the tree might give him the courage to do what he needed to do. Nyasha found him there the next morning. She had come to fetch water from the nearby well and had spotted his figure slumped against the tree trunk. For a moment, she considered walking away, leaving him to his thoughts. But something about the vulnerability in his posture stopped her. "Kofi," she said, her voice soft but firm. He looked up, his face weary but his eyes brightening at the sight of her. "Nyasha, I didn't mean for you to see me like this." She crossed her arms, standing tall. "What are you doing here?" He hesitated, then gestured to the tree. "I needed to remember, to think." Nyasha sighed, setting her water jug down. She sat a few feet away from him, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. "You've been gone a long time," she said finally. Kofi nodded. "I thought distance would make it easier. But it didn't. I've been carrying this weight, Nyasha, and I can't let it go." Her heart skipped a beat, but she kept her expression neutral. "What weight?" "You," he said simply. The memories of us. What we had. What we lost. That night under this tree, I thought it was goodbye, but it only made me realize how much I still love you. Nyasha stared at him, her emotions swirling. She had longed to hear those words, but now that they were spoken, she wasn't sure what to do with them. Kofi, she began, her voice trembling. You left. You gave up on us. Do you think words can erase that? He shook his head, his gaze earnest. No, I know I hurt you, and I can't undo that. But I want to try again, if you'll let me. I want to rebuild, not because of the past, but because of the future I still see with you. Nyasha looked away, her eyes misting. The baobab tree stood tall above them, its roots intertwined, its branches reaching for the sky. She thought of Mama Akiang's words, the idea that some bonds could never truly be broken. Do you really think we can find our way back? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Kofi admitted. But I want to try. I want to fight for us, Nyasha. For our family, for you. That evening, they sat together under the tree, talking late into the night. They spoke of their pain, their mistakes, and their hopes. It wasn't a magical fix, but it was a beginning. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Nyasha took Kofi's hand in hers. If we do this, she said, we do it together. No more running, no more silence. Kofi nodded, his heart swelling with hope. Together. And so, under the ancient baobab, they began to untangle their roots, weaving them back into something stronger. It would take time, patience, and trust, but the tree had stood for centuries, weathering storms and droughts. Nyasha believed they could do the same. The days turned into weeks, and Nyasha and Kofi began the delicate work of rebuilding their lives together. It wasn't easy. Their shared history was both a gift and a burden, a reminder of what they had once been, but also of the pain they had inflicted on each other. Still, they persevered, driven by a shared determination to make this second chance matter. In the village, their reconciliation was met with mixed reactions. Some whispered behind their backs, questioning Nyasha's decision to take Kofi back. Others watched silently, unsure if this new chapter would last. But the village elder, Mama Akiang, smiled knowingly when she saw them walking together to the market or laughing quietly under the baobab tree. The baobab tests us all, she told Nyasha one afternoon, as they sat weaving baskets. Its roots grow deep, but only those who nourish them with patience and understanding can truly thrive. Nyasha nodded, the elder's words resonating with her. She had come to realize that forgiveness was not a single act but a continuous choice. Each day, she chose to let go of a little more anger, a little more pain, and to hold on to the hope of a better future. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of orange and gold, Kofi gathered the children and brought them to the baobab tree. Nyasha followed, curious but cautious. Under the great tree, Kofi had laid out a mat and a small wooden box. The children sat eagerly, their eyes wide with excitement. What's this, Kofi? Nyasha asked, her tone light but wary. He smiled, his face softening. It's a promise, he said simply. Kofi opened the wooden box to reveal a small clay pot filled with soil and a young baobab sapling. He picked it up carefully and held it out to her. This tree, he began, his voice steady, is a symbol of us. Of the family we've built and the love we're trying to rebuild. I want us to plant it together, as a reminder that even when life is hard, we can grow if we nurture what we have. Nyasha stared at the sapling, her heart swelling with emotion. She felt a lump in her throat as she reached out to touch it. The children clapped their hands, thrilled by the idea of planting a tree as a family. Where did you find this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I asked Mama Akiang for help, Kofi admitted. She said every baobab begins with a single seed. I thought, maybe we could begin again, too. Together, they dug a hole in the ground beneath the great baobab's shade. Kofi held the sapling steady while Nyasha and the children gently packed the soil around it. When it was done, they stood back, admiring their work. The tiny tree looked fragile, but its roots were firmly planted in the earth. "We'll take care of it," Kofi said, looking at Nyasha. "Just like we'll take care of each other." Nyasha nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "One day at a time," she said. As the days turned into months, the sapling grew, its small branches reaching toward the sky. Nyasha and Kofi tended to it together, their hands often brushing as they watered and cared for the young tree. In its growth, they found hope, and in their shared efforts, they found healing. Their journey was not without challenges. Old wounds sometimes reopened, and arguments flared like sudden storms. But unlike before, they didn't retreat into silence or resentment. Instead, they talked, listened, and worked through their differences. The baobab became their refuge, a place where they could sit together, reflect, and remind themselves of the commitment they had made. One day, as they sat under the tree watching their children play, Nyasha turned to Kofi and said, "Do you ever think about how close we came to losing this?" Kofi nodded, his expression somber. "Every day, and I'm grateful we didn't." Nyasha smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "Me too." Years later, the sapling they had planted had grown into a sturdy young tree, its branches beginning to spread wide. The village children loved to play under its shade, and the elders often remarked on its strength. Nyasha and Kofi stood together, watching their grandchildren chase each other around the tree. Their hands were clasped, their faces lined with age but glowing with contentment. "We built this," Kofi said, his voice filled with pride. Nyasha nodded, leaning against him. "And it's stronger than ever." The baobab tree, with its roots deep and its branches wide, stood as a testament to their love, a love that had weathered storms, endured droughts, and grown anew. Stronger and more enduring than before,